Hi, welcome to Athbheochan. I'm Blue Niall, a musician, artist and designer from Dublin. In recent years, I've found myself increasingly drawn to exploring, through my work, Irishness and aspects of Irish identity. I started sampling traditional music, writing lyrics in Irish, and linking with like-minded people through collaborations. I started to notice that I wasn't alone. In the cultural fields of Ireland, something very interesting is happening. Athbheochan, or Rebirth, is a radio show about a new Celtic revival, looking at the explosion of new Irish art forms, utilising Irish accents, Irish language, samples of Irish music and colloquialisms, along with the renewal of interest in Celtic practices and aesthetics in Ireland and beyond. The show features music and conversation, and each episode will focus on a theme. I wanted to speak to a forward-thinking, young Irish generation that's fed up with certain aspects of the country and its culture, but immensely proud of other aspects. People who don't speak Irish but would like to learn, who are interested in Celtic mythology, and also love global music such as hip-hop and underground club music. SBTV are running a series of 6 episodes of Athbheochan to celebrate St. Patrick's Festival. This episode is called Siar. It involves looking back at our history via an interview with Dr Alex Tierney, a Canadian who came to Ireland to study Irish history and ended up staying and finding out some really interesting things about our past and what it says about where we are today. There's also a mix by Little O of some of her favourite classic Irish songs from over the years. Dr. Alex Tierney, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you too.
For people who don't know you and your research, could you just please introduce yourself, your specialism and your area of research?
Sure. And there's probably a lot of people who don't know me and my research.
So
for those of you, don't be embarrassed. So my name's Alex, and I have a PhD in Irish history. And this accent that you're hearing is a Canadian accent. So I came over here in 2012 to do my master's and then stayed on to do my PhD. So my PhD is in Irish history. I looked at gendered social policy relating to women in particular after the partition of Ireland. So what I did was I looked at laws and welfare schemes that were introduced north and south from about 1921 to 1939. So right after partition to the onset of the Second World War. And really what I did was I selected laws that had either a parallel law north and south, or laws in the north that were seen as sort of emblematic of Catholic social teaching in the South. So a big example of this is a divorce law or a law relating to the marriage bar. And I kind of examined, okay, sort of how could this law exist in Northern Ireland when in the absence of, say, Catholic social teaching? How were women discussed? How was sort of a morality discussed and all this kind of thing? So yeah, that's the medium version of what I did.
Thanks so much, Alex. And that's so interesting. Like, I'm really curious to hear, in looking into that, like, what were the main things that were surprising that came up? Like, how was that experience of doing the research, and what are the kind of key things that stuck with you?
How much time? How long is each episode? I guess, okay, so in terms of the big things, the fact that there was such similarities between North and South, things that we might say are such Catholic laws in the South, or welfare schemes, or even Catholic opinions exist in the North, and they were brought in by a Protestant Unionist government. So an example is attitudes towards unmarried mothers. Everyone, I'm sure, is very familiar with the situation in, again, what was the time called the Irish Free State. That existed in the North. In fact, some laws were introduced in the North years before they were in the South. One of them being a law I looked at where they were bringing in child support for unmarried mothers. the support was only going to the child. There was no sort of not spousal support, but there was no mother support. And I mean, the opinions that were expressed, even those were surprising. There was a big fear that by giving a woman the power to sue a man for child support, the amount of paranoia that she was going to blackmail him for her. Yeah. And we can talk about this a little later, but like in terms of paranoia about giving people welfare and paranoia of the sort of scheming person on the welfare scheme is really, really interesting and still prevalent today. Another thing is sort of being a Canadian researching in Ireland is a very interesting experience. Being an outsider, really, sort of researching. It's quite impressive. I think this is really amazing, but how knowledgeable Irish people are of their history. The participation and engagement in Ireland in Irish history is pretty interesting. Across all, like for instance, and maybe this is because we're in a decade of centenaries right now, but if you go to any public history talk, I would bet my life's savings that someone's relative will be there, whoever they're speaking about. And when I was doing my PhD, we'd have these weekly talks. So I think people knew that they were going on, but it was really impressive to see each week. Like I remember someone was doing a paper on missionaries in Kenya, I think it was. And these nuns came who had been there, which I'd say be pretty intimidating. Like if you're giving a paper and the person who lived the experience is sitting right in front of you. But you see that a lot. And I think that's really, really impressive. There's a real kind of respect of history and like a real, I don't know, discussion about it, which I think is really interesting. So there's sort of the academic history, the pop history, and then the sort of conversational history that people have, which I think is really interesting in Ireland. And it comes up a lot. And that's not with just my historian friends, like it does come up when you meet people. I think that surprises me too, actually. I was surprised about the sort of, you're not from here, responses that I would get in a kind way, but it was pretty condescending. Like, I remember I was giving a paper at an unnamed institution, and one of the professors, this is after I completed my PhD, so I'm certified in knowing something. And one of the guys kind of said, like, he was asking me a question about something that was really obvious, and he said, "You wouldn't get this because you're not from here." But, and then it was like, wow, people in this area are conservative. I was like, oh, okay. Well, actually, I do. I do get it. And maybe that's a thing in every country that people get. I don't think that's probably a uniquely Irish thing, but maybe that's just an experience as an outsider coming in. But it is that sort of surprised me. I'd come up against that a fair.
That's so interesting. Yeah, that experience of you're not from here, and that kind of sense of otherness in doing the research. And that's something that I've seen happen with you, actually, because we also know each other socially. And like, I think it's a really funny situation that comes up when we're in the pub and you're talking, or someone is talking about Irish history, because as you say, we love to do that. And then people forget, or, you know, kind of put aside the fact that you've got a doctorate in it, and then are talking about it. And I think there's a gender aspect to that too, right? Like, because there's almost mansplaining, and then there's Irish splaining, I don't know, from here splaining that's happening at the same time. Like, so one thing that I'm really interested in is the phenomenon of like armchair republicanism, right? Which is that, like, as you also said, that Irish people have more of a passing knowledge maybe of our history than other places. And I think we aggressively learn our history because it's, you know, sort of erased. Like, even people in England, they just don't seem to learn in school anything about what happened. And I think that we're maybe like then completely clinging on to that. But what's funny, and like some people like Rubber Bandits have done really interesting songs, kind of, you know, taking this down as a phenomenon, but like, it's like people will have this surface level idea of Irish history, and they will use that as a stick to beat people with, while actually not necessarily putting in the depth of time and effort to understand. And like there's this sense, like the Rubber Bandits have a really funny song, and it's mouthing off about it but not maybe having that depth, whereas you've kind of maybe got the inverse, where you do have the depth but then you maybe haven't been raised to do the mouthing off and the kind of madness.
And to be honest, like I'd be really uncomfortable doing that, and maybe that's why, you know, we're in the club, or let's just say the club, we're in the pub, and people are talking about Irish history, and I think I'm so aware, and again, this could be also a very gendered thing, but I'm so aware that I'm not from here. Like I have a PhD in history, and if someone's talking about Irish history, like I will be a bit hesitant to kind of jump in certain areas, because I'm very aware, and I think the reason that maybe Ireland knows its history so well is for all the things that you're saying there. And also, you know, 100 years isn't that long. Like 100 years generationally, as I said, like you can go to someone's talk on the treaty debates and you'll get the grandchildren of people who were there. You know, and I think there's a protective element there. In Ireland, the population is so small. Like I think, I don't know, I totally understand that. And I wonder if I was in your position, like I don't know if I'd probably react differently because I'm from here. But I think, and I remember studying that because actually my master's was on more recent history. It was on female prisoners in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And I looked at a prison chaplain in his kind of lobbying work and stuff. And I ended up not pursuing that from a PhD because I really was uncomfortable. I didn't know the nuances of that time period. It's also obviously just so much more recent, but I still think that can even go with the time period that I looked at, the 1920s and 1930s. And in particular, like thinking about the figures that I looked at were women who were what was called necessitous women. So like unmarried mothers, widows, like people who needed the state help, who were very vulnerable. And it's a sensitive history that I just, I think the more I found out about it and the more opinions I had on it, the more I'm very careful when I talk about it. But again, that could be just also me being a nervous person.
So what was it like why what was your initial impetus that made you decide, you know, and I don't know if it was one decision or a series, but like, I'm going to fly halfway around the world and study the history of this country in Ireland, like, and did that change, like, from that initial motivation? And maybe you could even pull in, like, what was your sense of Ireland around the time you were making that decision, and how did your understanding of Ireland kind of change over that time frame?
So I have an Irish last name, full disclosure. And growing up, Ireland was discussed as in it was this thing that was, you know, we're aware of our last name and that kind of stuff. But I've always been very embarrassed by sort of like a romanticization of this Irishness, because when I moved here, like I've never been so aware that I'm not Irish. Like I am Canadian. And anyway, so I think for a long time I always told myself, like I started studying Irish history just because I found it interesting. But like what actually, if I really think about it, like what drove me to start to open the first book or to do anything like that. I remember when I was going to study for my undergrad, my friend's dad was like, "Oh, what are you most excited about learning in your undergrad?" And I said, "Oh, do you know, just things that like we don't learn in high school." And one of the things was, I was like, what else was going on in the world during the First World War? And he laughed at me, and I was 17 years old and I didn't know anything in the world, but he laughed at me and he went, I'm pretty sure it was just the First World War. And then I honestly think that this is what pushed me to do my first Irish history essay, is that I found out about the 1916 Rising. And I was like, something else happened during the First World War. And like, seriously, that was the impetus that made me study first. And then I actually found it interesting because it's such a complicated history. And I found it, just complicated is the word. I thought it's just like layer upon layer upon layer in Irish history. There really is like all these complications. So that's how I got into it. How did I decide to move here? I really just liked it. I found something really interesting. I didn't know what to do after undergrad. So I thought I'll apply to a bunch of places. I got into Trinity, came here for my master's. And then once I finished the master's, I just stayed on for the PhD. And then that's how I fell into that. In terms of what I knew about Ireland, like I didn't know anything. I didn't know. I had a historical idea of Ireland. I had an idea of like I had a conception of Ireland. I didn't have I couldn't tell you what Dublin looked like. I'd never been to Ireland before. I really had no idea. And then I even remember thinking that before I moved here. I remember a week before I moved, I was like, what am I doing? I've never been to Ireland. I don't know anyone on the island. I've never lived outside of the city, Ottawa, that I'm from. Anyway, so I had no idea. So in terms of what surprised me when I moved to Ireland, absolutely everything, because I had no idea about anything. I remember before I moved here, I was Googling, what do Irish people wear? Like, what do people in their 20s wear? Like, I was just like, how can I fit in? How can I be a butterfly or a fly on the wall or whatever? So my ideas of Ireland. Yeah.
Actually really enjoying it. And the idea of you searching for the like Irish person starter pack or whatever. And
yeah. Oh my God. If that was available, I would have bought that. It's so funny. So I've been here 10 years now, and it's difficult to think of the before sense, but I think a big reason for that is that there wasn't like even picturing what Dublin looked like. I remember flying into Dublin and driving down the airport road, like the one into Drumcondra, and just being like, where am I? Like, it looks so normal. I just really enjoy, like, I can't believe I'm going to say this. I enjoy like the crack. Like I would miss that, you know? But really, yeah, that definitely, absolutely. Like, I just feel like I'm always kind of laughing and smiling and all this kind of stuff. And I would miss that. I'd miss the Irish way of life as well. North America is really go, go, go. It's really like, go to the gym, go to work really hard, you know, push yourself. Even things like, this sounds quite superficial, but I think this kind of says a lot. In Canada, for instance, you get 2 weeks of annual leave every year. So 10 days. Whereas here you get 22 or something, is it? Even that is just kind of, I think that demonstrates a value of kind of a work-life balance that you wouldn't get in North America. I really appreciate that here. I think it's a much nicer, and it's still, if you want to be super ambitious and competitive, you can. And obviously that's really pushed, but there is just a tiny bit slower version of life, which I really like. Yeah, people, the way of life. I would definitely miss that. On another superficial note, the Guinness, in terms of things that surprised me, I was talking about this with Peter before. I was like, what about Ireland is new to me? Spice bags, I would miss those. Curry sauce. Yeah, but so far, yeah, that's, I think, what it would be. It would just be the way of life and the people.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much for taking us on that journey. I felt like I was living through a mini experience of coming to Ireland there with you. So you said something really interesting, which was that there are certain beliefs or practices that we see as deriving from this kind of Catholic, you know, best Catholics in the world type mentality that we've had, etc. But you found that actually, you know, even in areas where it was a lot more Protestant, like these things were still, or, you know, where Protestants were in the ascendancy in Northern Ireland, these things were still happening, and actually, so in some cases happening, you know, even sooner. And you talked about attitudes towards unmarried mothers. Obviously, something that's, you know, we're still hearing about the horror of it is the Magdalene laundries. And like, I'm curious, like, and this is where I'll probably show my own ignorance about what should be my history, that I should probably know better. But like, was that confined to the south? Like, was that also, were similar things happening in the north, or was that a, like, you know, because I would definitely see that as a distinctly Catholic kind of shame on the country, staying on our history. But I don't know if that came into it at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good question. And the answer is that was happening north and south. And in the south, it was happening through Catholic orders and Protestant orders. There's a Protestant Magdalen Laundry on Leeson Street, and there's a Bethany home in Rathgar. But that was happening all around the world. There are Magdalen Laundries in Canada, Magdalen Laundries all around the world. And I definitely, like, there is no way I'm giving the Catholic Church a free ride on this one. It was absolutely Catholic social teaching, but it wasn't just Catholic social teaching. It was a conservatism that presented itself in Ireland through the Catholic Church, certainly, but in the north, it was through Protestant churches. It was also through lay groups. And I think this is a really interesting point that's made a lot in literature on sort of this idea of the role of the church, is that it was a societal sort of phenomenon, this idea of Catholic social teaching. That, you know, I'm sure if you talk to friends, parents, or anyone like that, I know some friends have, their parents would talk about walking by the Magdalen Laundry, and you're just kind of aware, okay, yeah, that's what it is, and those are the women, and this kind of thing. So societally, it's really interesting. I think that's more interesting, is the sort of everyday stories of people who existed alongside these institutions. And I think in my work, that's what I really liked. I kind of ended up getting more fascinated with these ideas of women and these conceptions of, or conceptualizations of women. I ended up looking a lot more at that, because really, like, studying law is so interesting, because a law isn't representative of the truth often. It's representative of a concern or a reaction or a need. So, you know, in the 1980s, they talk about moral panics and that kind of stuff. But you can see that in the 1920s and 1930s, again, just using that example of that bill for unmarried mothers, that concern about blackmail was in the North and the South. And in the South, actually in both constituencies or jurisdictions, they ended up including this provision in the law that, how does this work? It was a provision in the law that the courts would be closed to the press and to the public for these types of cases, because they were seen, there was a big concern that by hearing about sex out of wedlock and hearing about all this stuff, that the public would then get infected with these sort of moral wrongs. But that concern existed North and South. But it's interesting because that violates this idea of an open court, which is also so that's why actually in Northern Ireland they didn't end up going forward with it, because they had to conform with the British law. But sorry, I'm sort of meandering here. I forget where I was going. But anyway, it's just what was my point on that? I don't remember.
Well, I'll say something and then I might come back to you. But like, I think it's so interesting because conservatism, like, now that I think about it, which I haven't, and thank you for kind of making me think about it, because it's really interesting. But like, the conservatism, obviously we look at the Catholic Church now and look at some of the things that they were up to and just think, oh my God, that total conservatism, you know, and that fear that was there about what would happen if people were, you know, doing certain things or whatever. But I've also heard conservatism leveled at Protestants as, you know, and obviously, you know, it's a massively sensitive area still today. Do you know what I mean? I've got Protestant friends and I've got Catholic friends, and hopefully, do you know what I mean? This isn't offensive to anybody, but the thing, like the things you see, like say if we take a show like Dairy Girls that was a big success recently, right? And they explored this kind of hilarity of the kind of stereotypes of Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, and things came up for the Protestants like, Protestants keep their toaster in the cupboard or something, or their TV in the cupboard, and it like speaks to this type of conservatism. It's interesting to be like, who is the conservative? You know what I mean? What I hear and what you're saying is that there was a general conservatism that was across the board, that was almost as much cultural, you know, reinforced by the churches, but you know, actually transcending them to some extent as well.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of, it was there's I can't remember which author said this, but these are not my words. But basically, you know, it's the air that we lived and breathed. It would have been like Catholicism in the South. But I think generally that air was actually just a conservative air. And then the conductors in one area were Catholic and the conductors in the other area were Protestant. And I think it just speaks to a wider conservatism that was happening all around the world as well. Well, in my work, I looked specifically just at areas that had kind of like Commonwealth areas, because I wanted to look at that trace of kind of British law throughout the world. It was an easy kind of way to keep the thesis tight a bit. But yeah, you see that everywhere.
Do you, Alex? So like, I'm really interested in your view on this, and this is part of, you know, the meta thing, that reason that I'm really happy to have you on the show is to kind of get this like slightly outside inside perspective on things, right? During your time in Ireland, you've lived through like really interesting historic events here, such as the marriage referendum and various, you know, the I was going to say the repeal referendum, the abortion referendum, and those are things that in certain circles anyway, we massively pat ourselves on the back around. We are becoming this more open, you know, liberal, tolerant, accepting country and culture. Now you've come from a place where you've got Justin Trudeau and whatever, like the liberal darling of the world there as well. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I'm sure that also in your experience in between the Guinness and the spice bags and everything else, like you maybe tripped on some of these elements of cultural conservatism that might still be in place, because I definitely have seen them. Like, where do you think we're at? Is this generalized conservatism that you've picked up on gone? Is it still here? Is it gone underground? Like, are we kidding ourselves thinking that we're at the races? You know, have we moved past this age? Like, what, you know, some people point to direct provision as a direct lineage from the Magdalen Laundries. Like, what's our kind of scorecard from your perspective
by me
on these things?
I'm Blue Niall, and this is Athbheochan. In creating this show, I worked with some of my favourite people, and we had lots of extra content. I decided to split the interview in this episode into 2 parts. The rest will be aired in my regular slot in Dublin Digital Radio and through my Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. Gur míle mágad, agus bear.
I just lay low, I can't lay back. I'm an anxious boy since it was way back. And I lost my youth, don't wanna way back. And the walls to be, I wanna break that. All the fakeness, I don't play that. Hate the ways that they chat, try to pull me on the same track. No way lad, le the Charlene, she a cathaf, nila sagum, fuin gadraf, chame blita, ima chola, kubla mila, solar stop me, na me kinta, agus tosa, lana dina, tashi lofa, bi mcdausa, glocka shota, kubla bangers, saksa pota, bi mcdausa, egg flat, Chrissy cash is me shot, Aaron August ni Iran, she extana me ek brand, tashi tap.